Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now. I sit within the thought leadership part of the Knowledge and Practice Directorate at RICS, and my role is to look at the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, finance, brokerage, valuation, building surveying, asset management. It's clearly a huge canvas upon which data and technology is having a huge impact. And indeed, our members also work across all the major asset types: land itself, residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So once again, a huge canvas upon which data and technology is having a very profound and positive effect on the sector. And I'm really happy today to have Brittany join me from Qualis Flow. So welcome to the conversation, Brittany.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here.
Real pleasure. Now, it's always nice before we sort of start talking about the technology and some of the actual value that comes from using technology to get a bit of the kind of personal backstory here. So it'd be great to hear about your backstory and a bit of the origin story of Qualis Flow itself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a civil engineer by training. I've been in the industry for about 12 years now. Started my career working for Mott MacDonald, then went on to work for Arup and then later Bureau Happold Engineering. And while I was working in engineering consultancy, I met my co-founder, Jade. She was working for Skanska on Crossrail and then later HS2. And I think we kind of bonded over this love-hate relationship with construction. It's a phenomenal industry. It literally builds the world around us, but it has this dark side. It's not the most efficient and not the most sustainable. And so in 2018, we founded Kubeflow with the sole ambition of helping construction be more responsible and more sustainable. But having been in the industry for a number of years, we were really conscious of and really sensitive to the fact that any technology we were introducing to the industry had to be appropriate for the people that are in the industry, had to be sort of usable and also add value to the bottom line straight from the first day. And so we spent a lot of time really making sure that Kubeflow was fit for site, fit for purpose, and ultimately that we weren't just making the world more sustainable, but also making, construction teams' lives easier and more cost effective as well.
Indeed, and obviously, I mean, it's a real cliche to sort of emphasise, the importance of net zero and decarbonisation as a huge topic for the industry right now. I mean, from the perspective, particularly perhaps of quantity surveyors and other construction professionals listening, what do you think that the biggest changes have been when you reflect over the last 5 years or so that the profession still needs to be made aware of? Because there's still a lot of, we're still on a long journey here, aren't we?
Yeah, and it's a journey that's going to continue. So in 2018, when we founded Kubeflow, sustainability was still very much a tick box exercise. Maybe the real pioneers were doing it with some seriousness, but most people were at best sort of talking about it, but not doing a great deal. And it was really in 2019 when Theresa May enshrined in law our sort of 2050 net zero target for the UK that people really started to take it seriously. But even then, no one was really sure what it meant for our industry, for us in construction and engineering. And so we sort of went, oh, okay, that will probably mean something. And then 2020 came around and all of a sudden they went, oh, that means us. Oh, right. So all of these companies started coming out and declaring net zero. They all sort of said, yes, we're going to be net zero by such and such date. But a lot of them didn't really have the baselines or really have the roadmap in order to actually get to that point. And then obviously we had the pandemic, which caused a huge shift in the way that our industry operates in terms of being a little bit more friendly to technology, a little bit more sort of aware that it can be a real supporting function and that it can help us accelerate our ambitions as opposed to being something scary and really not sure what we do with it. And then in 2022, we've had more and more legislation coming through that mandates it. So over that time, our industry's seen this shift from sustainability being a bit of a niche sideline that only a few people really care about, to all of a sudden being a board level issue that companies are now shifting their strategy around. And that's been backed up not just by a lot of legislation and regulation that's coming through, but also a lot of the funding and a lot of the capital that's being funneled into our industry has quite strict ESG requirements around it that are being sort of influenced by some of the big pension funds, saying that if we're going to back your new venture, your new development, then you've got to show that you're doing that sustainably and responsibly. And for quantity surveyors, a huge part of that is about having that quantified evidence database behind where that money's going, how it's being spent across the supply chain, and really what that means, not just from a financial perspective, but also from a carbon and from a social and ethical perspective as well. So there's been various bits of legislation that have backed that up. The key ones that I think people will be aware of is the PPN 0621, which came in 0621, unsurprisingly, which basically says all public projects over 5 million in value, I think it's 10,000 square feet, have to have a way of reporting on, tracking and measuring and eventually improving their scope 1, 2 and parts of scope 3 carbon. And the scope 3 includes transport emissions coming from across the supply chain, but also a certain level of embodied as well. Now, RICS has obviously brought out their own guidance around whole life carbon assessments, which obviously doesn't just apply to public projects, it also applies to private. And we're starting to see Part Z, which will be an amendment to the Building Act, that also mandates this level of whole life carbon scope 3 reporting, which will fit very much within the remit of quantity surveyors across our industry.
I suppose what's interesting when you mention some of those drivers there, that it's this mix now, hopefully a powerful positive mix of legislation, following the money, dare I say, in terms of the funding and what really are becoming requirements for capital to be deployed. But I guess hopefully also simply the industry also, I think, recognizing it's the right thing to do, from the perspective that actually it shouldn't just be forced upon the industry and the sector. One hopes now there's that sense that actually this is the right thing to do from a kind of an overall ethical position as well.
Yeah, and we certainly see that from a lot of companies that we work with. They're talking about the fact that this is in part being driven by their need to attract the next generation of talent, and that next generation are being very discerning about the type of companies that they work with and the sort of ethical mission that those companies have. Equally, we're hearing it from the sort of top down, where you've got these sort of directors and CEOs of these companies saying, my kids are slamming me on this, my kids are asking, what am I doing? And all of a sudden I'm going, what am I doing? And so we are seeing this shift from a more of an internal locus of control, of people saying, actually, I feel like this is the right thing. I want to be working for a company that I feel excited and proud of. And so it is also coming from an internal perspective as well as those external drivers, which is wonderful. But it helps to have that sort of carrot backed up with the stick as well.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. No. Now, and I guess you alluded to this earlier on in terms of kind of usability and if I can use the phrase, the kind of sharp end of construction. What does this all mean, this decarbonisation agenda at that sharp end, on site during construction, a project handover, and overall that whole kind of record data keeping issue? What does this really mean on the ground?
Yeah, so at the really nitty gritty in the trenches end of things, it means a lot more reporting. And that's something that's been increasing in our industry anyway, and it's become a frustration and a burden for a lot of site teams as well. The reason so much reporting is being asked of us is because for so many people, our industry is a bit of a black box. It's very hard to see what's going on, particularly because there's so many layers where you've got the investor, the developer, the general contractor, the subcontractors, and then the supply chain underneath. It's very hard to actually get a clear, transparent, sort of accountable picture. And so that's why we're being asked to report so much on all of these things. So for construction teams and for quantity surveyors who are part of that delivery process, they're going to be asked to collect information across the supply chain, all as far back as they can go, to show that the materials that are coming onto site are from ethically, responsibly sourced locations. How far away have they come from? What are the carbon emissions associated with that? What are the embodied carbon emissions associated with the production of those materials? And what does that mean for the long-term sort of safety and health of the building. So we'll be asked about things like volatile organic compounds in things like carpets and paints, which ties into a lot of the certifications around WELL and BREEAM. And there's just this huge plethora of information we're being asked to pull together from hundreds, in some cases thousands of different organisations, which is incredibly complex, but also incredibly time consuming and frustrating for site teams. So within Kubeflow, what we've really focused on is trying to strip all the complexity and the pain out of that process by working with the workflows that we already have. So not introducing something new, not trying to get all of these hundreds of suppliers to suddenly change the way that they work to meet this one project, which we all know doesn't really happen. And you know, some of the big projects like HS2 are great examples of where they've tried to do that, and even with their level of buying power, they've not been able to. You know, we can't expect an entire supply chain to change for a £5 million small development. So with Kubeflow, we've stripped that all out by just saying, you know, take a photograph of the delivery slip that comes with that receipt that comes with the materials and the waste transfer note that goes off with them. And that's already in play. You've already got those pieces of paper, but instead of trying to collect them and type them into systems, just take a photograph. Everyone can use a smartphone. One of the sort of standards we set ourselves is that our industry, about 60% of it is made up of workers over 50, and they've started their careers all the way from, you know, 16, leaving school, working their way up. So any system we built had to be approachable and appropriate for someone of that background and that skill set. Most people have a smartphone these days, most people can take a selfie, and so that was the sort of complexity threshold that we set ourselves. And so that's all you have to do with Kubeflow to get that data. We then use machine learning to do all the heavy lifting to extract all the information that's required for this reporting. So for the site team in the trenches, super simple, just take a picture. For the project team and for the quantity surveyors who need that detailed, rich image across the entire supply chain, you've got it all in one place. It's enriched with the third-party information you need so that you can then start feeding into these whole life carbon reports, these BREEAM and LEED certifications, and everything else that goes with what we're being asked to do these days.
So in that sense, I mean, you've mentioned a number of things there as kind of outputs, but what is the big opportunity once you've got all this data? Because obviously data is very powerful, but what are the really big opportunities? And as you mentioned, you know, the different tiers of the construction sector. I mean, there's lots of people working in this, you know, on a big project. What is the big opportunity? What can you do with this data now you've got it?
So interestingly, this data can be used for different parts of the construction process, and the three core areas is cost, quality and carbon. So from a cost perspective, it helps you get a much more detailed picture around what's going on across your supply chain and can help you manage that sort of invoice verification bit. So instead of having to chase goods received notes from across the supply chain, you've got them all there. That whole prompt payment process, really simple. Then from a quality perspective, you know where those materials are coming from. Do they meet the standards of the project? And particularly when we start thinking about the golden chain of data, everything that's come out of the Hackett review, having that evidence chain of, you know, what was that material that actually came on site, not what was procured and specified, because that may have been correct, what was actually delivered. That's really important from a quality control perspective and making sure we're managing those safety aspects with the project, but exactly the same data. And then finally, on the carbon side, that data becomes so valuable because you can understand your scope 3 carbon at a really arm's length way. You don't need to go and mandate your supply chain to provide all this detailed data, which ultimately they struggle to do. You know, they've got limited capacity and resources, so it's really tough for them. So you can get all of that picture just by taking a photograph. And so you can then understand the embodied carbon of the materials, which is a key part of whole life carbon. You can understand the carbon emissions associated with transporting those materials to site, which again is one of your scope 3 carbon pieces. But you can also start to understand where within your supply chain there are opportunities to improve that. And this is where, when you start looking at this data from a holistic perspective across your project or across a portfolio of projects, you start getting some really big value. So you might be able to see that actually this supplier is not that great at sourcing low carbon materials, or they seem to find them from really far away, or they have lots of substitutions that don't meet the quality standards of our project. So maybe we either need to help them understand the requirements of the project and have that conversation, or we choose to work with a different supplier. Equally, you might find that you've got a waste carrier who is just brilliant at delivering low carbon, high recycling, high reuse rates of the way that they're managing your materials and your waste. And actually, you want to really work with those and give a bit more work to that supplier in particular, and focus less on those that are maybe sending more to landfill or sending them halfway across the country. And what's been really interesting over the last 5 years to see is that you see that full spectrum just on one project. You'll see that a project might have 8 waste carriers, some of them that are taking them miles away and have really high landfill rates, and some of them that are handling the exact same waste, but it's going much more locally and they've got really high reuse rates. And by having that transparency and having the data to back it up, it's a much more straightforward procurement decision. It's a much more straightforward cost management decision to understand where you focus your work and your efforts with your suppliers to make sure that you are delivering not only a sustainable project, but also an efficient and a cost-effective one as well.
So how would you talk to a business now that had perhaps begun to implement this and then began to sort of think, well, actually, what more can we do? You've talked about lots of great things they can already do, but what does this mean now for businesses looking at data in this different way, thinking, the next 3, 4, 5 years? What do you think the roadmap looks like for businesses using this kind of much more data-driven approach, and indeed using machine learning and all the various flavors of AI to kind of add a lot of value to the raw data they're collecting?
Yeah, so the first thing I always say to the teams that we work with is eat the elephant a bite at a time. I think sometimes it can look incredibly overwhelming. You've got to report on all these things and you've got to sort this bottom line issue, and we've got material price inflation, and oh my God, there's so much to handle. How do we do that? And sometimes it takes that moment to go, okay, what's the most painful thing today? Let's tackle that. So a really nice example of this is when we were working with Canary Wharf contractors, and they had lots of things that were frustrating and painful, and lots of things that they were aspirational around and they wanted to tackle, but you can't do it all at once because you've only got a limited time and capacity as well. So we said, right, what's the number one thing that you want to fix right now? And they said, right, we're going for FSC certified project. All of the timber that's coming onto this site, we've got to make sure that that timber is FSC certified, not PEFC, not uncertified. It's got to have that standard. And so with Kubeflow, we were in real time auditing the timber that was being delivered to that project and flagging to them, okay, this is uncertified. Either the supplier just hasn't provided that information, or it's not the right material for your project and you need to go and take that off site. And so it was giving their project team the opportunity to really focus in on one quality aspect that was really important to them. Once they'd dealt with that, they were able to actually have an open conversation with the suppliers that were regularly substituting in the wrong timber and say, look guys, for this site, it's got to be FSC. If you don't have it, don't send it. Don't send us uncertified stuff. And just through having that conversation, they were able to reduce the number of non-compliant material deliveries they had by 80% in the space of 6 months. So real tangible change for the project, massive reduction in risk and cost as associated with just having that information to hand in the right format at the right time. They were then able to go and look at waste. Waste was their next tackle area, and now they're starting to look at carbon and embodied carbon and tying that into their BREEAM and other certifications. So focusing on one area and then chunking it up. Now we're working with companies where they're looking at their entire portfolio of construction projects, where they've got hundreds of sites that are using Kubeflow, and now they're starting to look at that data in an even more nuanced way and starting to say, well, this project seems to be outperforming this project for both waste generation, but also in terms of delivering on those sustainability targets. Why is that? Is that something to do with the way that the project's operating? Is it something to do with the geography that it's in? And they're starting to be able to ask those questions of the data in a much more focused way to optimize their entire portfolio, not just real time what a project's doing. Now that's when the data gets insanely powerful, and you can really see companies leveling up and actually being able to outcompete and outperform from a profit perspective as well. And so it's start simple, understand where the pain points are, but build it up to something that really is transformative for businesses as a whole.
So from what you're describing, Brittany, I suspect if somebody knocked on your door, virtually tomorrow and said, "Tell me more about Kubeflow," you'd almost kind of not talk so much about the technology, but say, actually, let's talk about the business issues here. Let's talk about the things you're trying to achieve, and the technology is a given. It's simple to use from a kind of site perspective, and the machine learning does the clever stuff for you in terms of turning those photographs into data. But it sounds like you'd have a much more kind of business-focused conversation than technology-focused.
Absolutely. And I think that comes from partly our background from being in the industry and understanding that construction is a bit unique and every project has its own challenges. And we'd love for it to be like manufacturing and everything perfectly repeatable, but it isn't. And you can't fit a round peg in a square hole. You've got to really understand where it is the industry is at right now. And at the moment, it is a matter of having that conversation and saying, what's painful? How can we help? The beauty of something like Kubeflow is that because it's so flexible and because it allows you to capture all that data in a really simple way, you can get the full breadth of its capabilities from day one, but you can focus on the bits that are important. Then once you've got that, you've already got that foundational data to go back and look at your supply chain when you're ready. So you're losing any value by not using it from day one. You're building up that sort of bank of information and that rich picture of your entire supply chain. You can focus your efforts here to start with, but you've already got that opportunity for the future when you've got time and capacity to come back to it.
And I suppose that particularly plays to a sort of critique I've heard from many people looking at kind of digital adoption across the built environment, that they want a return on investment. And by this, as you said, eat an elephant one bite at a time. I think it's much easier to show that ROI if you're very focused on a particular business issue, solve that, show the outcomes in positive terms, and then move on to the next one. Because I think there is that danger in trying to boil the ocean, really, isn't there, in terms of trying to do everything and then really then falling into that trap of thinking, well, technology is not actually delivering any return on investment here.
Yeah, and I think with every project, the first thing we do is we sit down and go, okay, what are the important outcomes for you? What are the KPIs or the OKRs that you want to work towards? And then we make sure that as we're deploying with them, we're focusing on those areas and that we can obviously build on top of that as we go through.
Indeed. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation and very timely, given the importance of the whole net zero and decarbonisation agenda, and as you said, the various standards that we're working on in terms of whole life carbon, and this continued pressure, which, as you say, is coming from a number of directions here in terms of legislation, funding, and to use the phrase, doing the right thing. And as you say, I think it's important when you're looking at that next generation coming into the sector that we are a sector that is attractive because we've been seen to doing the right thing. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, for today, thanks ever so much, Brittany. Look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, Andrew. And if anyone needs to find anything else about Kubeflow, then obviously you can find us on our website. We're www.qualisflow.com. I'm sure Andrew will put a link to it below, or you can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn.